Hi, my name's Sheehan, and today I'd like to talk about Ace in the Hole, the 1951 film produced and directed by Billy Wilder and starring Kirk Douglas and Jan Sterling. And I'd like to go through this film exploring the structure of the plot as well as the themes that crop up in this movie. Now, if you could sum up this film in a sentence, it would be something like, it's about a self-serving and ambitious newspaper reporter who shamelessly profits from another person's misfortune. And you could split the story really up into three acts. In Act 1, we're introduced to Chuck Tatum. Chuck has gone through a difficult time. He's a highly ambitious newspaper journalist, but he's fallen on hard times. He keeps getting sacked from various jobs, although he has this supreme self-confidence, perhaps bordering on arrogance, and he seems to think that he is just a godsend to any newspaper despite his previous misdemeanors. But he's obviously very good at his job as well. And he finds himself in Albuquerque in New Mexico, and he introduces himself to the boss of the local paper there. He basically forces his way into the office in an extremely cocky way, and he gets the job. And he meets the other people in the office. His boss is called Mr. Boot. He's a very kind of straight-laced, hard-working and kind of dependable character. The kind of opposite of Chuck, really. Chuck straight away picks up the fact that he wears not only a belt but suspenders as well. He double-checks everything, Mr. Boot. Mr. Boot seems to be a man of integrity. Now, Chuck has got every intention to get out of this local Albuquerque newspaper as quickly as he can. He envisages he'll be there for a few weeks or whatever. But it turns out he's still there after a year, and he feels frustrated and depressed. However, he's given an assignment to go and cover a rattlesnake hunt a few hours away. So off he goes with his kind of protege, who's called Herbie Cook, who seems to look up to Chuck, and they go off. And on the drive there, Chuck is giving Herbie all kinds of tips which you wouldn't find in journalism school. They eventually stop at a gas station in this town called Escudero, and Herbie notices this lady praying. They soon become aware of a man who's become trapped within a cave in a mountain which is sacred to the native indigenous peoples of the area. But this man has been going in taking kind of grave goods, etc. And sadly, the cave has collapsed on him and he's trapped. Chuck smells a story. So instantly he kind of goes into overdrive, and he goes into the cave and meets Leo Mendoza, who's just trapped under the ground. Chuck passes him some food and drink and a blanket to keep him warm, and Leo thinks that Chuck is just a friend, really, just someone who just wants the best for him, to look after him. But of course Chuck has got ulterior motives. This is his ticket back to the top in the news business. Chuck sees this as the scoop which will turn his life around. Now, Leo Mendoza's wife, who's called Lorraine, she runs the kind of local service station. It's like a gas station stroke restaurant stroke souvenir shop, and they're not doing good business. She's kind of estranged from her husband, and she doesn't seem really too bothered that he's stuck under the ground. Chuck gets to know her, and she is prepared to leave Leo in the cave But Chuck persuades her to stay, not necessarily for her husband's sake, but he persuades her that she's likely to make loads of money when people come and get wind of this story, because he's expecting lots of visitors. And of course Chuck wants her to hang around because she's an integral part of the human interest angle in this story. And indeed, the first family come, the first tourists come to this mountain, the Cave of the Seven Vultures as it's called, because they've gotten wind of what's happened. This story, which Chuck has written up for the local Albuquerque paper, is gaining traction. In Act 2, this kind of media circus descends on this cave where Leo is trapped. Chuck is trying to get all the people of influence under his thumb so that his story will be as good and as profitable for him as possible. He meets Sheriff Kretzer, who is also electioneering to be the next mayor, and he kind of makes a deal with the sheriff. If he gives him exclusivity for this story and keeps the other reporters at bay, he will help him win the election, because he will paint him through his newspaper articles as some kind of hero. We're then introduced to Smollett, who is the kind of engineer who's able to get Leo out of the cave. And he wants to just brace the walls of the passage and get some people in to get Leo out quickly. But this doesn't tie in with Chuck's plans. Chuck wants this story to last as long as he can, maybe a week. He sees Leo's quite a strong character, ex-military, so he thinks Leo will not be too affected by this. And to prolong the story, Chuck persuades Smollett, this engineer, along with the sheriff, to drill from the top of the mountain, which will take a lot longer than Smollett's idea. Smollett is quite a weak-willed individual, and he's persuaded to go along with this plan. Now, as the radio comes in and more people pour in to this remote area in New Mexico by this mountain, there's almost this town kind of pops up there. There's so much activity. Even a carnival comes in. This story has really captured the kind of interest of people for miles around. And at the centre of it is Chuck pulling the strings and poor Leo trapped in this cave. And Leo's mental health is deteriorating now. He's been stuck here for a few days. He's finding it difficult to breathe, and he just hears this drill bearing down on him, and it's causing him all kinds of mental anguish. Mr. Boot, the owner of the paper Chuck is working for, comes and criticises Chuck's methods. He really sees this as gutter journalism. But Chuck's not too bothered. He's going to leave with the paper anyway. He's expecting bigger newspapers, perhaps from his beloved New York, to come and ring him up and hire him because of this massive story. It's also in this act that Chuck and Lorraine's relationship kind of develops in perhaps a rather unhealthy way. At one point, Chuck slaps her around the face because he wants her to have the impression of being much more distressed about the situation than she really is. By this time, she's making lots of money out of this. And possibly start an affair as well. In the final act, Leo is convinced he's going to die. And the doctor confirms this to Chuck. He's got pneumonia. He's been stuck in the same position, breathing in this horrible dust for days and days. And Chuck is beginning to show remorse for his greed and his self-interest at the expense of Leo. Chuck, by this time, has accepted a new job from the top paper in New York, but Chuck has now realised that he is responsible for Leo's demise. It's Leo's wedding anniversary to Lorraine. He loves her, but she doesn't love him. He doesn't realise that. And he has got these cheap furs he wants to give Lorraine, that she asked Chuck to give to her. Chuck does give them to her. She refuses to wear them. Chuck forces her to wear them because he wants to do the best he can for Leo now. But then she stabs Chuck with a pair of scissors. This is the beginning of the end for Chuck. Despite his stab wound, Chuck gets a priest for Leo, and the priest administers the last rites. Leo dies, and Chuck announces this to everyone from the top of the mountain. The crowds depart, including Lorraine, Leo's wife. Chuck now, at all costs, wants to tell the truth. I suppose to purge his guilt before he dies. So he tries to tell the editor, the New York paper he's been employed with, the truth, but the editor just thinks he's drunk, and Chuck finally stumbles into the offices of the local paper in Albuquerque, and he collapses in the office before he can tell them what's happened. And that's the end of the film. So Ace in the Hole is a really interesting and compelling film. It's a very bleak film, actually. It seems most of the characters, indeed the people generally, you know, the people milling around this cave, are really self-serving, sensationalist, greedy and corrupt, basically. It really paints a rather dark picture of humanity. Chuck is an extremely dark and unlikable character, really. He's willing to do anything to get his scoop. Until the end of the film, he's not bothered about who he crosses. He's a hard, uncompromising, brutal figure. He's not scared to use his fists when necessary. He slaps Lorraine, Leo's wife, at one point. He punches the sheriff as well. There's not much which is redeemable about Chuck, although it's a small mercy that at the end of the film he wants to put the record straight. And around Chuck, Lorraine, Leo's wife, is a rather deplorable, hard-hearted character who cares little for her husband being trapped in this cave. She's prepared to leave him despite the pain of Leo and his mother and father. The sheriff is this utterly corrupt character who's just a bit like Chuck, concerned about his own career, his own progress up the slimy pole. One of the few characters who he does seem decent is Mr. Boot, the proprietor of the Albuquerque newspaper. And Leo himself seems fairly decent in the terrible situation he finds himself in. But overall, the characters really display the darkness of the human heart. And even these families travelling to the site are just there. They have no empathy for Leo. It's all about entertainment for them. The film is incredibly cynical about the newspaper business. We have that embroidery in the frame in the office in the newspaper at the beginning about telling the truth. And of course, Tatum does everything but tell the truth, as indeed some of the others do around him. There's also a lot about being trapped. The sheriff keeps this trapped rattlesnake in a box. And the rattlesnake really is a metaphor for how the characters are in this film. Of course, Leo is physically trapped in a cave, but Chuck Tatum, thinks he's trapped in this small fry local newspaper. He feels he's going nowhere. Leo's wife Lorraine feels trapped in her circumstances. Her life hasn't panned out the way she wanted it to. You get the impression that the people at large in this film are just trapped by their own kind of sinful, self-serving nature. It's a kind of a critique on rampant capitalism as well, I think. Initially, to get into this cave of the Seven Vultures is free. There's a sign, no one visits it, it's just a free kind of attraction. But then as more and more people hear about it through the newspapers, that the admittance goes up to 25 cents, 50 cents, 75 cents, $1, etc. It's quite amusing to see that as the film progresses. And of course, this massive carnival descends on this area, and there's even a song made up about Leo stuck under this cave, and people selling souvenirs and rubbish left, right, and centre. A lot about greed, I guess. Kirk Douglas just is a really strong performance from him. You know, he's just seems to really inhabit this part. And the supporting cast, Jan Sterling and the others, are really good as well. It's a really good film, well worth a watch if you haven't seen it. And I've just left a brief slideshow of the structure of the plot and the themes after this. Thanks for watching. Bye.